Victoria Hayes stood tall on the Army firing range, her posture firm, her breathing steady. The sun beat down on her face, but she didn't flinch. Around her, the sound of rifles cracking filled the air, soldiers aiming and missing. Yet Victoria, just 24, fired shot after shot, and every bullet found its mark. Her weapon was not just a gun, it was an extension of herself. She was calm, almost too calm, her blue eyes locked on the distant targets as if nothing in the world could distract her. Her fellow soldiers began whispering. "How does she do that?" one asked, shaking his head. "She's not even trying," another muttered in disbelief. For them, hitting a bullseye was a challenge. For Victoria, it was second nature. The sergeant, a hardened man with years of experience, watched in silence. He had seen good shooters before, but never like this. "Hayes," he called out. "Step back." Victoria obeyed, lowering her rifle. She stood at attention, disciplined, but inside her heart raced. She knew what they were all thinking, that her accuracy, her unshakable calm, her almost inhuman composure, was not normal. The sergeant studied her carefully. Then, with a voice rough but measured, he asked, "Who taught you how to shoot like that?" The question hung in the air. Soldiers turned their heads, curious, waiting for her answer. Victoria hesitated. Her lips pressed together, her eyes softening. For the first time, she wasn't remembering training manuals or instructors. She wasn't remembering the army at all. She was remembering her grandmother. The firing range melted away in her mind, replaced by a dusty Kansas farm, the smell of cornfields, and the quiet evenings of her childhood. Her grandmother, Ruth Hayes, had been the one who placed the first rifle in her hands when she was just 12. Not for violence, not for war, but for survival. "Steady your hands, Victoria," Ruth would whisper, guiding her small fingers along the trigger. The rifle isn't about anger. It's about focus. It's about knowing who you are. Victoria had grown up in a world where her father was absent, her mother too lost in her own battles to guide her. It was Ruth who became her anchor, stern, wise, unshakable. On that farm, she taught Victoria more than just how to shoot. She taught her resilience, responsibility, and the importance of carrying yourself with dignity. Even when the world tried to break you, that Ruth was not just a grandmother. She was a protector, a mentor, a warrior in her own quiet way. She had lived through the Great Depression, through wars, through heartbreak. Her strength was not in her hands, but in her spirit, and that spirit had been passed down to Victoria. Like an unbreakable flame, back on the firing range, Victoria's voice finally broke the silence. She looked at the sergeant and said softly but firmly, "My grandmother taught me." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. The other soldiers exchanged puzzled glances. They expected her to name a trainer, a military program, maybe even some elite school. Instead, she spoke of her grandmother, a woman they had never met, but one who had left an unshakable mark on the young soldier before them. Victoria didn't explain further. She didn't have to. Deep down, she knew that every bullet she fired, every calm breath she took, was a living testament to Ruth Hayes. Her grandmother's hands were in hers. Her grandmother's voice was in her ear. And though the army would one day know Victoria Hayes as a soldier of rare precision and strength, she knew the truth. She was nothing more, and nothing less, than her grandmother's legacy. The sergeant didn't press further, but in the days that followed, Victoria's name began to circulate. Soldiers talked about her in the mess hall, her name whispered with equal parts respect and unease. Some admired her, others envied her, but none could deny she was different. Her accuracy on the firing range soon carried over to missions. In training simulations, while others hesitated, Victoria stayed composed. She didn't just fire. She calculated, she anticipated, she understood. Night during an overseas operation, her unit came under ambush. Chaos erupted, shouting, gunfire, panic. Soldiers scattered, trying to find cover. But Victoria, breathing steady, remembered her grandmother's words. Focus, child. Fear will blind you, but calm will guide you. She steadied her rifle, her heart beat slow, and took precise shots that turned the tide of the fight. Her calm saved lives. By dawn, her unit survived largely because of her decisions. Yet, when her commanding officer praised her, she simply nodded. She didn't brag. She didn't boast. In her heart, she whispered a quiet thank you to Ruth Hayes, the woman who had prepared her for storms she could not have foreseen. But war leaves scars. Weeks later, Victoria sat alone, staring at her hands, the smell of gunpowder lingering in her memory. She had seen friends fall, heard their last breaths. For the first time, the weight of her gift felt like a curse. Was this really what her grandmother wanted for her? To be a perfect soldier in a broken world. She nearly broke. But then she remembered something else, her grandmother's final lesson spoken in the quiet of a Kansas evening long ago. Victoria's strength isn't just pulling a trigger. It's choosing what you fight for. Never forget, your gift isn't meant for destruction. It's meant to protect. Those words steadied her more than any weapon ever could. From that moment, Victoria fought not for glory, not for recognition, but for the lives beside her, the men and women who depended on her calm when fear consumed them. Months later, she returned home on leave. She walked up the same dirt path she had once walked as a child, back to the farmhouse where Ruth Hayes now sat in a rocking chair, older, weaker, but with the same steel in her eyes. "Grandma," Victoria whispered, kneeling beside her, "they think I'm strong because of how I shoot, but the truth is, it's because of you." Ruth smiled faintly, her weathered hand resting on Victoria's. "No, child, it's because you listened." And in that moment, Victoria Hayes realized her story wasn't just hers. It was part of a greater legacy, born from a woman who had taught her that true power was not in the weapon, but in the spirit behind it. Time passed, and Victoria's reputation only grew. Her unit began to call her the calm in the storm. Whenever missions grew tense, when fear threatened to paralyze even the strongest soldiers, everyone looked at her. And without speaking a word, her steady presence reminded them they were not alone. But recognition comes with its own weight. One evening, Victoria was summoned to the commanding tent. She expected another mission briefing, but instead, she was met with silence. Her commander slid a folder across the table. Inside was a letter sealed with the presidential crest. "Hayes," he said firmly, "your actions saved more than just your unit. They protected civilians, allies, and even children caught in the crossfire. Washington knows your name." Victoria froze. She had never fought for medals, never longed for fame. Yet here it was a call from the highest office. Weeks later, Victoria stood in the White House East Room, her dress uniform pressed, her grandmother's worn dog tag hidden beneath the collar, a silent tribute to Ruth Hayes. Rows of veterans, generals, and dignitaries filled the room. Cameras flashed. The president himself approached, holding a Medal of Honor. "Specialist Victoria Hayes," his voice rang out. "Your courage under fire, your loyalty to your brothers and sisters in arms, and your unshakable calm in moments of chaos embody the very spirit of this nation. Today, we honor you not just as a soldier, but as a protector of life." As the medal rested on her chest, Victoria didn't see the president, nor the crowd, nor the cameras. She saw her grandmother, frail, but smiling proudly, eyes glistening with tears. Ruth whispered under her breath, almost too soft to hear, "I told you, child. Your gift was never for destruction. It was for protection." And in that moment, Victoria's heart broke and healed at the same time. Because she understood, the medal was not hers alone. It belonged to Ruth Hayes, to every lesson whispered under starlit Kansas nights, to every sacrifice that shaped her spirit. Closing speech segment. Victoria stepped up to the podium, her voice steady yet heavy with emotion. "I accept this honor. She began, not for myself, but for the woman who raised me. My grandmother, Ruth Hayes, taught me that strength is not in the weapon you hold, but in the choice you make. She taught me that calm can save lives, and that protection is greater than destruction. Every life I saved, every mission I endured, it was because of her voice guiding me. So today, I wear this medal for her, for all those whose quiet strength changes the world without ever firing a shot. The room stood in silence, then erupted in applause, not just for a soldier, but for a legacy. And as the cameras captured the moment, Victoria Hayes bowed her head, for she knew her story was no longer hers alone. It was part of something greater, a chain of strength passed down through generations, unbroken, eternal.
The ceremony ended, but for Victoria, life did not suddenly become easier. The medal around her neck was heavy, not just in weight, but in meaning. When she returned home to Kansas, neighbors lined the streets with flags. Children pointed at her uniform with wide eyes. Mothers whispered blessings, and old veterans saluted with trembling hands. Everyone seemed to see her as a hero. But inside, Victoria carried the memories that no medal could erase. The cries of wounded soldiers, the faces of civilians she couldn't save, the heavy silence of those who never made it back. One night, unable to sleep, she walked out to the old barn where her grandmother once told her stories under the stars. She held the medal in her hand and whispered, "Grandma, they see me as a hero, but I still feel like that little girl who just wanted to protect." It was then she realized the medal was not the end of her story, it was only the beginning. Instead of retreating into silence, Victoria chose a new mission. She began visiting VA hospitals, sitting with wounded veterans who had lost hope. She spoke to young soldiers struggling with fear, teaching them the same lesson Ruth taught her, that calmness is not weakness, it is power. Her words carried weight, not because of the medal, but because of her sincerity. She didn't speak like a decorated soldier. She spoke like a sister, a daughter, a fellow human who had carried pain and still chose compassion. Soon, invitations poured in. Universities, military academies, even international peace conferences. People wanted to hear her story, and every time she stepped on stage, she carried her grandmother's voice with her. At one particular event, a young cadet stood up after her speech. His voice shook as he asked, "Ma'am, how do you keep going, even when the weight feels unbearable?" The room fell silent. Victoria paused. For a moment, her own pain rose to the surface. Then she answered slowly, "You keep going because someone else needs your calm more than you need your comfort. You keep going because the strength you carry was given to you, not for yourself, but for others. And you keep going because quitting would dishonor those who never got the chance." Tears filled the cadet's eyes, and in that instant, Victoria realized her words had become more than speeches. They were lifelines. Years later, when Ruth Hayes passed away, the funeral was not small. Soldiers, veterans, students, and even generals traveled to Kansas to honor her. Not because Ruth was famous, but because her teachings had shaped Victoria, and through Victoria had touched thousands. At the graveside, Victoria stood tall in uniform, her medal gleaming in the sunlight. She placed it gently on the casket and whispered, "Grandma, you gave me this strength. Now I give it back to you." The crowd bowed their heads. Some wept, for they understood the true honor was not in the medal, but in the legacy of wisdom passed from one generation to the next. As the casket of Ruth Hayes was lowered, Victoria's medal rested atop it, gleaming softly in the sunlight. People gasped, how could a soldier part with such an honor? But Victoria knew the medal belonged to her grandmother's wisdom more than her own courage, and that single act spoke louder than any speech she had ever given. News of Victoria's gesture spread quickly. Reporters asked, "Why give away something so valuable?" Her reply was simple. "A medal hangs on a wall. Wisdom lives in people. And my grandmother's wisdom deserves to live forever." That answer went viral. Soldiers, teachers, mothers, and even children shared her words across the nation. Suddenly, she was not just a decorated soldier. She had become a voice of calm in a restless world. Soon, Victoria was invited to mentor young cadets at a military academy. She didn't teach them how to shoot faster or march straighter. Instead, she gathered them in silence and asked, "When fear rises, what will you do with your calm?" At first, the room was quiet. Then one by one, cadets began sharing their fears, their doubts, their hopes. And that day, Victoria realized she wasn't just training soldiers. She was shaping leaders who would carry her grandmother's spirit forward. Her journey didn't stop at America. She traveled overseas, meeting children in war-torn villages, sitting with mothers who had lost everything. Where generals carried weapons, Victoria carried only compassion. And surprisingly, sometimes her quiet presence calmed more hearts than entire armies could. Her grandmother's lesson had grown beyond Kansas. Now, it belonged to the world. Years later, on the anniversary of her grandmother's passing, Victoria returned to the same Kansas farm. Children from the town gathered around her, eager to hear her stories. She looked at them just as Ruth once looked at her, and began, "Once there was a girl who thought calmness was weakness, but then she met a woman who taught her it was the greatest strength of all." And in that moment, the circle was complete. The story that began in one farmhouse had grown into a legacy touching thousands, perhaps millions. While cleaning out the farmhouse, Victoria found an old wooden box. Inside was a yellowed envelope addressed to her, in her grandmother's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter read, "Victoria, one day you will realize the world does not need more medals. It needs more hearts that refuse to break under pressure. When that day comes, you will know your purpose." Tears blurred her vision. Her grandmother had seen her future long before she had. Months later, Victoria was invited to deliver a keynote speech at a national ceremony honoring veterans. Thousands gathered. Cameras flashed. Yet, when she stepped on stage, she did not speak of war. She spoke of calmness in chaos, love in loss, and courage in compassion. Her voice cracked, but her words were unshakable. That night, her speech was replayed on every major channel. For the first time, people were not talking about her as a soldier. They were calling her the granddaughter who carried wisdom into battle. But with recognition came weight. Not everyone understood her message. Some critics sneered. "Calmness doesn't win wars, guns do." Others accused her of being too soft for a soldier. At first, those words stung, but then she remembered Ruth's eyes, steady and unshaken. Her grandmother had also been misunderstood, and suddenly Victoria realized criticism was proof that her message was challenging the world to think differently. One evening, after a speech at a military academy, a young cadet approached her. He confessed that he struggled with fear every night, terrified he wasn't strong enough. Victoria knelt, placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Courage doesn't mean you never feel fear. It means you don't let fear decide who you become." The boy's eyes filled with tears, and that single moment reminded Victoria why she had chosen this path. Not for applause, not for medals, but for the souls she could guide. Years later, Victoria returned to the same firing range where her story began. She stood silently, the sound of gunfire echoing in the distance. But this time, she wasn't holding a rifle. She was holding a journal filled with the lessons her grandmother had passed on. As the soldiers practiced, she told them, "Every bullet teaches aim, but every heartbeat teaches balance. Remember both." In that moment, she realized the girl who once trembled at the range had now become the teacher of calm. On her grandmother's 100th birth anniversary, the town gathered once more. A statue was unveiled, not of a soldier, not of a fighter, but of Ruth Hayes, seated on her rocking chair, hands folded, eyes calm. At the base were engraved her words, "Stillness is strength." Victoria stood there, tears streaming down her face. The metal she once laid on her grandmother's casket had now transformed into something greater, an internal reminder that true power begins not with force, but with calm. Victoria Hayes was not born into a family of warriors. She was born into the quiet hum of a farmhouse, where her grandmother Ruth Hayes raised her with a single unshakable lesson. Strength is not in how loud you are, but in how calm you remain when the world shakes around you. As a child, Victoria sat on the porch, listening to her grandmother's steady voice while the field swayed in the evening wind. She never knew then that these quiet lessons would one day guide her through the fiercest storms of her life. The first test. At 17, she stood on a firing range for the first time. The world around her thundered with the sound of rifles. Her hands trembled. Fear surged through her chest. But in that chaos, she remembered her grandmother's words. She took a breath. She let the noise